Welcome to the first episode of Make Monsters Monstrous. So, in this series, I want to take the monster manual from Dungeons and Dragons and just kind of go through it creature by creature. There's a fine line between talking about a game and giving tips or advice and straight out giving the game away. So, I don't want to do that. So, we're not going to be necessarily showing stat blocks or talking about every little aspect of everything. This is basically going to be a series of tips about running the various monsters in the monster manual, making them more intimidating or just more memorable, taking the standard stock goblins or kobolds or whatever and making it so that they're useful even at later levels. Usually after level 2 or 3, usually those monsters, GMs, DMs, whatever term you prefer, tend not to even use them, at least not use them effectively. They tend to just be fodder for helping out another creature or another boss. But this is kind of an introduction video. This is going to be some tips that will work for any game or any creature, and you're going to see these kind of laced throughout all of the creatures. And the first tip to making monsters monstrous, to making them memorable or even just useful beyond what most people do, is tip number 1 is outside of some undead and constructs, monsters have the same drives to survive as player characters do. They want to win, they want to survive, they want to make it through. Like I said, some undead like skeletons or zombies, they'll fight to the death, every last one of them, because that's what they're created for, that's what they're commanded to do. But if you have a group of 5 or 6 goblins going up against 4 players and 3 of the goblins go down, the others should try to retreat, they should try to survive. They're not unintelligent, stupid creatures. Well, they might be stupid, but they're not suicidal, is the point. That they have goals. And basically it's to survive and win are like the most basic goals. And when we get into individual monsters in the manual, we'll talk more about how different monsters have different goals. Second is that they have abilities. And not just statted abilities like the Aarakocra can fly or certain creatures can dig or things like that, but even their skills and their characteristics, knowing what those are and using them to effect. Like goblins can be sneaky, so use that. They should be trying to ambush players. Like I said, individual monsters, we'll get into that more, but knowing the creature's abilities and then using them, it helps keep the fight from being just a back and forth slugfest. Also, don't be scared to give monsters abilities. We'll get into that with some of them, borrowing from other Dungeons and Dragons editions or other games. To give monsters unexpected abilities can be a really good idea. Another thing to remember, this is more D&D specific than some of the other tips, is challenge rating. CR is a guideline, not a rule. Other systems have other things like ranks for villains, like the Star Wars role-playing game from Fantasy Flight uses minions and rivals and nemesis. I think that's the order. And even with those and challenge ratings, those are guidelines. More important than the actual challenge rating that's given are things like action economy. That's a really big one. That even having just one more enemy than your party can make a huge difference, because they'll have a lot more attacks, they'll be acting more often. Not a lot more, they'll have technically one more attack, one more action. But that can add up quick, right? If you have one person who's a tank and 2 or 3 enemies get on him, he can actually go down a lot more quickly than you think. So the action economy matters more than challenge rating. Next up is to make the encounters make sense. This is another general tip. This one is another one that applies pretty much to all games. The idea that certain creatures should exist within certain settings or parameters. You know, you're not going to find a random goblin all on its own out in the middle of the desert, but you might come across one in a cave or something like that on its own doing something. Encounters should make sense. There should be certain it should just make sense. Next up is this is more for if you're doing like a sandbox game where players even at level 1 could kind of go totally off book and end up out in the middle of the wilderness where you have creatures that are really way too strong for them. But foreshadow if a individual monster is going to be too much for your party. Maybe have them come across other dead adventurers or just whatever you can do to foreshadow, hey, you guys are getting into an area you might not be ready for. And also be able to encourage your players to not think they have to fight to the death. This kind of ties into this as well. The same way that monsters shouldn't be afraid to run, your players shouldn't be afraid to run, and you should encourage that. Always give them an out. If they're getting into an area that you don't want them to be in, but you're running a sandbox game, and so they can go wherever they want, give them outs, give them foreshadowing, and then if they still try to fight the red dragon at level 1, yeah, kill them all. Who cares? Not all encounters need to be combat. This is the 6th tip, that encounters can be more than just fighting. You can have more than just the players swing their sword and then the goblin swings his sword. Going back to the idea that most creatures have other motives besides just, hey, there's some adventurers, let's just kill them. For example, having a boss in a dungeon who knows he's losing, he's lost a lot of his minions, having him just take a moment to try to negotiate, talk his way out, or if he's winning, have him stop his minions from killing all the players and talk like, hey, I'll let you live if you do this thing for me, or vice versa. Like, if you let me live, I'll do this thing for you. Encounters don't always need to be combats to the death. Some encounters should not involve fighting at all. Some can start not combat, become combat, just keeping it dynamic. Don't think that because you've rolled initiative, now you have to fight till everybody on one side is dead. Keeping it more natural, more fluid. Number 7 tip, just kind of general tip, is to roll with the punches. Things are going to go off book. Things are going to happen that you don't expect. One of the characters is going to use an ability you weren't expecting. It's going to kill the main bad guy right off the thing, and now you just got a bunch of minions. Just roll with it. Or maybe you have a combat encounter that you think should be really easy, and it starts to go bad for the players. Just roll with it. And also, don't think that you have to stick with what the stat blocks in the book say. If you throw an enemy at a group of players and it's way too powerful for them and you weren't ready for that, just make it a little weaker. The players, unless they have the monster manual right in front of them, aren't going to know you changed anything anyway. And even if they do, it's your prerogative to make one enemy more powerful or less powerful, taking a creature from the monster manual and making it more powerful. I think the monster manual even talks about this, like taking a regular orc and giving him some magic spells to create a shaman. I don't know if this one talks about it. I know other monster manuals have. But just because you are the dungeon master, because you are in control, use that control. The players aren't going to know you changed anything unless you tell them. So if they're in the middle of a dungeon and they're kind of beat up, they don't have time to rest, or you, for whatever reason, maybe there's a ticking clock, there's someone about to be killed, or there's a ritual going on, and so they have to keep pressing forward. Maybe when they get into the main room, instead of the boss and 6 minions, it's the boss and 3 minions, if they're getting beat up. Or maybe they're plowing through your dungeon and they haven't even used most of their spell slots and they're about to go into the final fight, way more powerful than you expected them to be. Throw in a couple more minions or some other traps or abilities, things like that. Just roll with the punches. Don't be afraid to change things. Remember that while you are the dungeon master and you're kind of constructing a world and a story and a narrative, the players are there too, and they're playing the game, and it is ultimately a game that everybody should come away enjoying. So if they're having fun and all of that, just roll with it. Don't put your story above the other 4 or 5 people at the table's fun. Just roll with it. Have fun. And just kind of like a last little bonus tip for making monsters memorable, making monsters monstrous. If a low-level enemy gets away in an encounter, if you're following that first tip of they want to survive, if one of them gets away, especially if he's been injured or something, have him come back later. It can really build this narrative idea that you kind of had a plan all along when you maybe necessarily didn't. I've done this before where one of the first encounters the players had, it was some goblins and an orc, and they killed all the goblins and they burned the orc, but the orc was on a raised platform, and so he bolted. He was burned, his minions were dead, he ran, and he got away. He escaped into the caves. And he came back later as, I forget what his name was. It was like Grognak or something. He didn't have a name at the time. He was just a low-level orc. I thought he'd die. But I gave him this name. I think it was like Grograk, and he was Grograk the Burned. And he had scars, and his armor was burned. But he was much higher level. I made him stronger. I made him basically a chief. And it was really memorable for the players. Like, oh, that's that guy that we attacked earlier, and he got away from us. And so just that kind of dynamic world, that dynamic story where what the players do early can affect what happens later. It really makes the world feel more alive, but it also makes it feel like there's consequences. If the bad guy gets away, he might come back more powerful. or maybe a bad guy who escapes early on, like the low-level wizard escapes, and later on, because you decimated all of his minions, comes to the players and is like, hey, there's a bigger bad than me that I was trying to fight with my minions, and now I need your help to beat this guy. You know, there's all kinds of ways you could spin it. A bad guy surviving, which just can be really fun and really memorable. So just keeping that in mind. So that's just kind of the general tips. These are gonna pertain to pretty much all the monsters we go into in one way or another. But outside of that, just keep it moving, keep it fresh, keep it memorable, keep it monstrous. And I'll see you on the next one where we'll be going into the monster manual, talking about the Aarakocra. I think it's the first one. And we'll dive right into that and see how it goes. See you next time.